Okay, there we go. Awesome. Okay, good afternoon, everybody who is joining us here in New Zealand, and good evening or early evening to you, Jan, and welcome to this chit chat. We're super excited to have you joining us today to talk about reading fluency. So thank you so much for giving up your part of your early evening to beam into New Zealand to chat with us.
Delighted to be here. I'm very pleased to have this conversation with you, Carla.
Awesome. So I'd just like to take a moment, Jan, to introduce you to our listeners and our viewers today. Dr. Jan Hasbrouck is a leading researcher, educational consultant and author who works with schools in the US and internationally. Dr. Hasbrouck worked as a reading specialist and coach for 15 years and later became a professor. Her research in reading fluency, academic assessment and interventions, and instructional coaching has been widely published. She is the author and co-author of several books, curriculum materials, and assessment tools. Jan continues to collaborate with researchers on projects related to reading assessment and intervention, and enjoys volunteering at her grandson's K-8 school in Seattle. Again, welcome. It is a real treat to have you giving up your time to speak with us today, Jan. So let's jump into our first question. And our first question for today's chat is, could you please take a few moments to define fluency and explain the components of fluency to us?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And that's a very good place to start, is defining this term. And I think, so it's complicated even at the beginning to define the terms. We often, I think most of us who are reading people, teachers, specialists, or researchers in the area of reading, when we are in that context and we say fluency, most of the time we actually mean text reading fluency. We're talking about children reading connected text or passages, something like that. And we shorten that term sometime and just call it fluency. And I am trying to be more accurate and precise in my own conversation and delineating those things, because the word fluency has meaning all by itself, and generally, and it can be applied to lots of different things. And when we're talking about fluency generally, we mean accuracy and rate. And I'm saying those in that order for good reason. We are badly mistaken, sadly mistaken, when we think of fluency as rate or speed or reading quickly. It has that as a component, but accuracy is the foundation of what we would assume fluency. Just doing something fast but inaccurate, nobody would ever call that fluent. And conversely, just doing something perfectly accurately without any appropriate rate aspect of it would be something that we wouldn't recognize as fluency. But when we just use the term fluent, we can apply that to music. You're a fluent player of piano, or speaking a language. You are a fluent speaker of English. There are many areas where we use fluent, and I'm sure our discussion is going to go also into the components of text reading fluency. So we can use the term fluent to talk about letter names and letter sounds and word fluency. But I think what you're asking me is to define text reading fluency, what we reading people think of as fluency. I can pick up a book and I can read it with fluency, and that definition starts also again with accuracy. The foundation of all fluency is accuracy. Appropriate rate, not as fast as possible, but there is an appropriate rate, and we can talk about what that means. But we also, in text reading fluency in the reading world, add expression, or some people refer to prosody as that term, that as you're reading text, if you're reading it aloud, you are mirroring or mimicking spoken language. You have the tonality, the fluidity, the pitch, the tone, the all of that plays into what we more fully consider text reading or passage reading fluency. So those are the three primary components, and each one of them has some parameters around it, because accuracy, in order to, and so let's back up a little bit here too. The reason we're having this conversation, the reason I care about reading fluency, you care about reading fluency, is because of its contribution to comprehension. So we should never separate fluency from comprehension, the whole purpose of it. So actually, in a definition that I developed with a woman I co-authored a book on reading fluency, we said that reading fluency was reading at reasonable accuracy, at an appropriate rate, with suitable expression that leads to, or can lead, because it doesn't guarantee, but can lead to comprehension. And then we stuck in motivation there too at the end, because simply not based on research as much as our own clinical practice, that in our decades of working with struggling readers, we have yet to find a student who struggles with fluency who's also a motivated reader. So there's a connection between motivation and fluency. Just hasn't been really studied in research, but there's a real evidence-based connection between fluency and comprehension. So that's a long-winded definition of fluency.
That's
trying
great.
To lay a foundation for the complexity of this thing.
Yeah. Can we pick up on in particular, can we pick up on your term suitable accuracy? And can you give us a little bit more insight into what is deemed to be suitable accuracy? And because I think, you know, we have many teachers here in New Zealand and across the globe who are really working to build their knowledge and their practice to shift students away from appealing to the picture, appealing to the teacher's forehead, reading to the end of the line, skipping a word, going back, guessing. So I really feel there's a direct sort of correlation around the importance of accuracy and the move away from those strategies. But as teachers, if we don't understand that, Jan, then I'm not sure we'll push for really, you know, as close to 100% accuracy, because we don't understand the significance of it.
Right. That's very true. This understanding of this complex thing that may sound simple, the understanding is what will lead to best practice in classrooms and implementing it correctly. So the adjective we use actually with accuracy is reasonable accuracy.
Right.
Reasonable accuracy, appropriate rate, and suitable expression. So reasonable accuracy, and we came up with that adjective based on the research evidence that talks about the connection of fluency to comprehension. Their researchers have looked at what is reasonable accuracy for independent reading if you want to maximize comprehension. So we don't set the bar, and research doesn't set the bar at 100%. You don't have to have 100% accuracy in order to comprehend. And I always want to distinguish the difference between the work that I do when I have a student in front of me or a group of students in front of me. In that case, accuracy in an instructional situation is always going to be 100%. When I have the opportunity to make a correction with it, I will make that correction, because this is their opportunity to learn that that word spelled W-A-S is was, it's not saw or something else, that I want them to have that high level of accurate practice. I know you and many in New Zealand are fans of Anita Archer, as I am. And, quote her all the time on many things, but in terms of accuracy, I love what she says about the role of practice in accuracy, where, you know, we've all grown up saying practice makes perfect, practice makes perfect. And Anita corrects us to say, no, practice makes permanent.
Mm,
Perfect practice makes perfect. And
so
with that
true.
in mind, when a child is in front of me, or a student, an adolescent, or an adult, if I'm tutoring them, when I'm with them, accuracy is 100%, and we will correct it. And I will do that in an age appropriate way and a context appropriate way. Sometimes I will just tell them the word. Sometimes I'll say,
Yes.
whoa, would you go back and sound out that word? It really depends on the situation, but we will always read every word perfectly, accurately in practice. So that is so that when they're off reading by themselves, they can read with reasonable accuracy. And the research says that that's about 98%. There is some research that takes it down to around 95. So there's kind of a range that researchers will say. In order to comprehend, you need, you know, there's that idealized 100%, but you need to be at least 95 and around the range of 98% to allow for comprehension. And that, I think, when I first read that, it really sort of boggled my mind, that the idea that 95, if I'm at 94% or 92%, my comprehension is going to be impaired.
Yeah.
But it really is. I've got some activities that we do in workshops, that kind of thing, where you block out 5% of words, and especially in complex text, you're not going to be able to understand what you've read. So reasonable accuracy, we teach to 100%. So when they're off by themselves, they can have that reasonable accuracy that allows comprehension.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Such a great explanation. I think there are many people who will be listening in who do work either, you know, in a tutoring capacity, or in privately, or an intervention capacity in schools, and also parents too who are listening in. I think it's really important for our parents to understand about getting to that 100% when they're with you. I have this wee saying, it is that when we teach explicitly, we give the skills that then later become the strategies during independent time. And when you were talking, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about, you know, the importance of that support to give them the skills to be able to get to that 100% accuracy. And sometimes, like you said, that might come through sounding out the word and blending it back together, or you might simply tell it to them and ask them to repeat it back to you. Yeah, isn't it really great to see and hear, Jan, how all of this comes together around, you know, you brought Anita Archer into the conversation, and her great work around explicit instruction, and practice, you know, making permanent as opposed to perfect. We need to think about those things.
We sure do, because if we allow errors to happen then, and it's those high frequency words that we see, our children see all the time, so they have a lot of opportunity to practice the word was as saw, or before as because, or all those words that kids we know get mixed, were as where, those kinds of things. They see them so often, and if they're making frequent mistakes, those get permanently incorrectly mapped in their head, and every grade 4, grade 3 teacher knows what those words are, because their students have difficulty reading them and spelling them. So we want to fix that early on in a gentle, proactive, age-appropriate way. And I'm glad you, Carla, brought up parents, because I know some parents are taking on the role of teaching and tutoring, and did a lot of that during the height of COVID. But we also but teaching, I don't want parents to feel like when they're reading at night just for pleasure, practice with children, that they have to do the same level of correction as a teacher. I think that there really are differences in those roles. And if children are working really hard at school all day, then to come home and feel like reading is just more of the same, I would treat that a little differently. I would probably far more often just tell the word to the child. They're struggling with the word, they can't quite get it. I'm just going to say the word is beautiful. The word is hungry. Whatever it is that make the parent-child reading activity a little bit less stressful, a little more pleasure.
I think that's a really important point because, we think about fostering the role of parents and fostering a love of reading, and that, bedtime reading stories and listening to stories being read, the child listening to us read, and then vice versa. That really is a key part around fostering and enjoyment, and also building language comprehension and a rich vocab. So maybe what we're really wanting to point out to parents around this little piece of the chat is, in fact, be really clear on what your purpose is, and don't just because we all know, I think, or we may not know, but what we focus on expands. And when we have a new piece of learning, we're more often than not, as a parent or a teacher, to really hinge on that and practice. But I think we need to be really mindful of being clear of our purpose in reading to or listening to our child read. You mentioned before we came on the chat this afternoon, we need to get those brains rewired. And so I just wanted to bring that little quote of yours into this piece of conversation, where just previously you were talking about, we were both kind of talking about the work of Dr. Anita Archer, and really stressing the importance of perfect practice. And so, what we see in our 8 to 10-year-olds, in particular 8 to 12-year-olds here in New Zealand, and it'll be the same for you in the States, is that we see all those words, like you said, lodged incorrectly. And so I just wanted to bring you a little quote around the importance of getting those brains rewired comes through explicit teaching and ensuring that when with us, those students are aware of the correct decoding and pronunciation of the words that they're reading.
Yeah.
So if we go now to thinking about whether or not there's a progression of fluency development. So when we went into the definition of talking about fluency, we really sort of went into that text level. But I'm very interested to hear your perspective on what happens before that, because I'm anticipating that, if I can't read a word, if I can't get into decoding or reading a word, there's a really good reason for that potentially, in terms of what's mapped at different levels. So could you talk to us a little bit about whether or not there is a progression of fluency development from an accuracy perspective?
Yes. And actually rate comes in there too in the progression. So you're absolutely right, there is a progression. In order to get to that goal of text fluency, where we hope a child can pick up any text they want to, but at least what might be grade appropriate text, and read it and understand it, and we hope are motivated by the process. Before that, way before that, let me get my progression here straight. Before that, they need to learn to read words. And we have such a solid body of research evidence in this growing understanding that we're referring to now as the science of reading or structured literacy. We know so much about those early stages, the need to learn the letter sounds, what those letters represent. There's still conversation, not fully settled science, about the value of learning the names of the letters early on. There's more agreement that what's most important is the sounds, although in a lot of preschool situations with 3 and 4-year-olds, and parents teach the alphabet to their students, and there's no harm in doing that. But the big payoff to this text reading that we want is word reading, and the progression is learning the letter sounds by themselves. Just this letter that we call M represents a sound that we say So that's the accuracy part. I show you a symbol, you relate the sound. That's accuracy. At some point, that next component of fluency comes in, which is rate. we want eventually that recognition to be so mapped in the brain of the letter sound correspondence that it's instantaneously recognized. So we work toward that fluency in letter sound recognition. We work to really sort of the next stage. I mean, moving quickly is learning how to blend those sounds together. So you now know that this letter represents the sound, and this one represents the sound, and this represents the sound, and to blend those together and recognize that that word says man. So the accuracy, the first step for everything, accurately, perfectly, fluidity. Then we want rate. We want man, and then eventually we want you to look at that letter sequence, and you know man, because so the rate comes in, always building on that foundation of accuracy. So, and I'm really jumping right to, of course, the side of, if we're thinking of Scarborough's rope or the simple view of reading, I'm leaving language out there because there's language fluency and language accuracy that has to develop alongside it. But in terms of the word recognition piece, it's letter sounds, the sequence of sounds into a word, and then eventually phrases. But those all progress at accuracy first, then rate, and we continue to build on those things. We do, and whenever we talk about progressions, it's important, and I know all teachers understand this. We don't say you must learn all your letter sounds before we start reading words, and you need to read words perfectly before we can put words together in text. And that's not true. We're scaffolding and building those things. We'll take ideally just a few letter sounds, enough to make a few words, and then we can read a man. We can write, if we pick our sounds carefully, our letters carefully, Sam and man and Matt and maybe had, and make some meaningful sentences while we're still learning and introducing some of the less frequently used letter sound combinations. So the progressions are scaffolded and simultaneous.
And so what we're seeing in so many schools across New Zealand now, which is really exciting, is the adoption of a scope and sequence to do exactly that. We're seeing schools implement through both spelling and reading instruction a scope that really does work from simple to complex, and it builds up that cognitive load where we're going from focusing on that particular group of letters, making sure we can both read and write those sounds, then taking those letters and using those to form a word list, and then taking that word list and then going into a short passage or a text. So it's so logical, isn't it, when you think about the progression of that? And in my experience, Jan, I've found it's really empowering for teachers when they understand that progression, when they come across working with a student who is struggling to lift words off the page, because they're developing the knowledge and ability to fold back. Well, if they can't decode this in the text level, would they be able to decode it if it were just the word in isolation? And if they can't decode the word in isolation, is it actually that the problem sits at that rapid retrieval of letter sounds, or is it that they can't blend through those sounds? So teachers having this knowledge seems to be giving them the ability to really pinpoint more so and offer support at where the challenge with getting to that sort of accurate and with some rate, those components of fluency when they are reading at text level.
Yes, definitely. And that plays a role not only in the planning of the lessons across a scope and sequence, but for corrections as well. We've moved to here, but you're struggling with it. Then I back up a little bit and some things that are more solidly in your little brain and use that to build to the skill that you're struggling with. So it's both in overall teaching scope and sequence, but thinking about that progression in terms of a correction process as well.
Yeah. When you were talking about, these weren't your words, this was my interpretation, by the way, but you were talking about rate, and you were talking about, really I want to talk about retrieval, because I'm thinking about when I look back to what I've been in a position to learn over the past sort of 7 years, has been that actually the rate of retrieval is quite telling when you're working with a student. When you're working with a student and they are having difficulty retrieving a word or decoding it, is it instantly popping from their brain's letterbox, or is it actually that they're having to in their head decode, individually decode all of those sounds? And so I just wanted to bring that notion of retrieval and the rate of retrieval to the table and see if there was anything that you wanted to add in terms of that when we're thinking about building accuracy and noticing rate when it's slow and what the implications of that might be.
That's really important, yes, because the retrieval part happens in this box here that we can't see it. The behavioral manifestation of that is the rate of production, but it's just the manifestation of the retrieval process that's going on. And that, now you have raised one of those areas in this growing, evolving body of research that we have that still remains somewhat, well, I don't want to say controversial, it simply is unsettled science. We have still theories about what that retrieval rate is affected by, and theories about how we can assist students to improve that. So there are, and even measuring it. Should we use measures of rapid automatized, or should we just use a reading fluency assessment? So there are some interesting conversations still going on, and I think we will have those conversations for a while, simply because what we all really care about is happening in here, and we can't see it. But I think there is agreement, certainly, that there are individualized limitations in terms of retrieval, therefore in terms of rate production and fluency in certain brains, that there's agreement in most people that have really studied dyslexia, that one manifestation of dyslexia, which of course we should understand as a spectrum disorder,
Yes.
very mild dyslexia to very severe. So dyslexia is not a one size fits all. But if you, because this might not be true for the very mild dyslexic, but most people that have the neurobiological disorder that we call dyslexia, even with what we pray for all of these children is early identification and early effective intervention, because what we know is that we can rewire those brains. And even if they're born with dyslexia, we can essentially fix it to the point where it doesn't manifest itself except in rate, in fluency. One of the most intractable aspects about skillful reading that many dyslexics, even if they've had that early identification, early intervention, superb instruction along the way, and they can read and they can write, they often don't either read or write at the same fluency as their neurotypical peers. Fixing that aspect of retrieval seems to be the hardest thing to with. So that's with the children who really are born with those difficulties. We have a lot of children in our classrooms who seem to also, that they don't seem to have dyslexia, but they do seem to have retrieval issues. For some of that, it may be part of biology, neurobiology, the wiring of their brain. But for some of those students, they do just need more practice. If we've laid that foundation in accuracy, because we're never going to get to fluency if we don't have that. But if we've got that and students are still not quite as fluid as we would like them to be, their rate is not at that level we would call reasonable. Yeah, reasonable, accurate, suitable. No, suitable expression, appropriate.
Yeah, reasonable
Rate.
accuracy, appropriate rate. I wrote that down. Yeah.
And we use the word appropriate because even those of us who are blessed to be skillful readers, there are times when it's very appropriate to slow down. We're there, so there's not one rate that fits that sometimes reading real quickly. I'm reading for pleasure, I'm skimming and scanning. Speed should be fast. And then there are times when I'm reading something really, really important or really, really difficult. It's appropriate for me to slow down. But that's because I'm skillful. I can adjust my rate depending on my needs. But those children, going back to those children who have learned to read words relatively accurately. So good job, teachers, you've done that. But they're still sort of not at the rate level. Though there are interventions that we can do for those children and make them make their brain adjust that retrieval, whatever's happening here in this mysterious, seem to facilitate that retrieval so that their reading becomes more fluent, and therefore that usually has a positive impact on comprehension and motivation that I've seen. But and those kind of activities really do. You can practice rate. You can, and it can make a big difference for some students, but it all has to be, you don't just take a piece of text and have kids read faster. The piece of text, we need to be sure that they're reading it with high level of accuracy, because just fast reading that we sacrifice accuracy is not worth our time. And we want students always, at least in my world, anytime we're working on fluency, we're also we're connecting fluency to comprehension always, as I said at the beginning of this. So I might have a student read a piece of text that is fairly difficult for them, and then we practice so they really know all the words. So we've laid that foundation of accuracy. Then I would give them some opportunities, and the research seems to say that multiple short reads, perhaps 4 to 7 times, is probably optimal. And then we check to see if they can retrieve that and read with more fluency at a more reasonable rate. And then I'm going to ask them some questions about what they've read, because that we want them to never think that this is just about saying words. No, saying words is one thing. Reading is for a purpose always. So in fact, in our book, the book that I wrote with Deb Glazer, Deb actually came up with this little mnemonic, but I just adore it, but I can brag about it because she's the one who came up with it. She talks about teaching fluency or practicing fluency or doing fluency interventions and paying attention to the triple A, AAA. Every fluency lesson should have accuracy as part of it. Every fluency lesson should have automaticity, which is where we bring in the rate. And every fluency lesson above the word level, if we're into phrases, the third A would be access meaning. So when I'm working on a student and my target goal is to increase their fluency, that lesson, appropriate, developmentally appropriate, will have accuracy, automaticity, and access meaning as part of that lesson. And I think that's a really good structure to think about fluency lessons.
Yeah, that's really good, because I think for us, we have been doing a lot of work around building word level reading fluency. And now that AAA has really given us, we've been focusing on accuracy and automaticity, but we need to focus on the importance of that access meaning piece. So yeah, that's great. So if I was to say to you, what are your top 3 tips for classroom teachers, interventionists, people who are working with students who potentially struggle with fluency, what would your top 3 tips be? And they may be things that we have talked about previously that we can just bring back to the table. Just to kind of come to a wee bit of a close, what do you think your top 3 tips would be for classroom teachers?
Well, if I have made myself clear here tonight, everybody should anticipate that the first thing I'm going to say is that whatever level you're teaching, because it does happen in progressions, my top tip would be make sure you're always focusing on accuracy. That too often we think of fluency as just reading quickly. And if we sacrifice accuracy, we're just giving the wrong message to children. So make sure that accuracy is there. So I'm thinking right now of the very beginning readers who are just laying that, we're just reading words, and that's great. So we read the words accurately, and then I may go back. So my top tip is, I guess, always focus on accuracy. I guess my second tip would be repetition. It's repetition. Going back to Anita Archer, practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes permanent. And if we can make that practice perfect, then we make it permanent. And when it's permanently in the brain, orthographically mapped, as Linnea Airy has said, then we have the opportunity to retrieve it. So lay that foundation of accuracy first, but then do repeated practice to build that automatism. So at the beginning stages, that would be, look at these 6 letters that you know, say them for me. And they say them and mix them up and make sure we're not saying them always in the same order, so they know them in isolation. Now see if you can say them a little faster for me. So we build that automaticity. And at the word level, we want to do the same thing. Here's a list of 6 words or 8 words that we might have gone through that in a direct instruction lesson. I've modeled, we've done the guided practice. You've shown me you know these words. That's fantastic. Now let's do it again. And I want to make it a fun activity. We might turn it into a game, but we need that repetition. That's what takes us to that second A of automaticity. There's no way to get to automaticity besides repetition. And that's where differentiation comes in, because some of our students really do need 1 or 2 trials, and they've got it. They've got that letter. They've got that word. And I'm sure many who will listen to this work with those children for whom 20 or 40 or 120 repetitions might not be enough. So, repetition, and do it in a way that's engaging and fun, which is going to look different at the sound level or the word level or the phrase level. So those are more reminders than actual tips. My favorite, I think, tip for those children who we often classically think of as kids who struggle with fluency, they can read. They read fairly accurately, but they don't read with fluency, would be to use text that is fairly challenging for them so that they really have to work. Make sure before they read it independently that they can read all the words accurately. And then an instructional tip that I really like is right at that stage, when they've learned all these words, I give them a chance to read that text without practice. Just read it to me, a 1-minute read, and write that score down, and maybe even put it on a graph as your pre-reading score. Then that's the motivation, I hope, for doing the practice, the repeated practice. 4 times to 7 times. I'm going to tell you what I think your goal should be. And you're going to keep practicing 1 minute, and then another 1 minute, and then another 1 minute, and see if you can go farther down the text and reach a level where you can read aloud to me with reasonably good expression, because you can't sacrifice that either when you're reading to me. But now let's read it and see if we can build on that score that you did originally, the cold read. Now we're going to do a hot read. And graphing those things over time and watching those cold read scores go higher and higher. And then after we've done that read, and yay, almost always their hot read score is higher, so we can celebrate that. Then I'm going to ask you some questions about what you've read, because we always do AAA, we always access meaning. But that little routine of reading a piece of text that's kind of challenging, learning the words, doing a cold read, doing the practice, doing the hot read, asking questions, and then really celebrating that. I have found that that strategy is can be, if well implemented, highly motivating to kids and can really make a difference, that they see themselves getting better and they feel themselves getting better as a reader, and they are willing to keep doing the hard work.
And I can really see how that can apply to students who are, we know in classrooms and even in intervention settings when teachers are working with small groups of students, we know that we're going to have students achieving at different places and potentially working at different places. So there were two key things if we want to just think about the term differentiation. How do we meet the needs or the varying needs of the students that we're working with? You talked about the opportunity to differentiate through the number of repetition or the number of repetitions or the number of exposures that we give students to practice, where we observe some may only need it 2 times, 4 times, some might need it 20, 40, hundreds. So that's one way to differentiate. And then the other way was just that little process that you gave us, working through from the cold read to the hot read and everything that we do in between. So I'm absolutely 100% confident, Jan, that not only will people go away from this chit chat with a little bit more a deeper understanding about fluency, but also hopefully have a lot more thought-provoking conversations with their colleagues in their various settings about the implications of fluency, and then also have some tidbits that they can take away to be applying in their practice. The 3 real key tidbits that I've taken away are your very clear explanation of the importance of us realizing that we do need to teach fluency and recall and recognition at letter sound level, at word level, and then going into text level, that's really, really important. I love the AAA, and that's something that's going to sit with me. Do you have the book beside you where the AAA is from? Can you just hold that up for us?
I have a little sticker on here with my name on it. The name of the book is Reading Fluency. Yes. Written by myself and Deb Glaser was my co-author.
Thank you so much, because I do believe there'll be some people who want to look into purchasing that text to deepen their understanding a little bit further. So thank you so much for joining us today, for giving up part of your evening, and I'm going to give you the final word. I feel like we could sit here and talk all day, truth be known, but you've probably got to go and do things, and I do too. So I'm going to just hand over to you for the final word to close off this chit chat, Jan. And for everybody who's been listening to us, thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to our next chit chat next month. Over to you, Jan, for the final word.
That's lovely, Carla, and thank you for the invitations. That this has been lovely. Yes, somebody who's devoted many, many decades to the incredibly rewarding profession of helping children become readers. I am beyond grateful, deeply grateful from the center of my being for those of you who do this work and hang in there with our children who struggle, find ways to keep them encouraged and focused, and celebrate the incredible process of learning to read and teaching children to read.
Thank you, Jan.